Hello and welcome to Mirror Realm. My name's Nick, I'm known as Wyvern on the Discord, and I've got my sorcery playtesting buddy with me here today, Jarrod.
Hello.
And we're going to have an extremely long-form discussion about the Geomancer deck that we built together and that Jarrod ultimately played and won the Australia and New Zealand Championships with. So this podcast is done in two parts. This part is just a general introduction to the deck and detailed discussion as well of the entire deck list, discussing every single card in the deck list. And then in part two, we're going to just discuss a bunch of cards that weren't in the deck but might have been, and why they weren't in the deck, and also just about the tournament itself and how the deck went in the tournament and just the whole weekend, just in general as well. There's links in the description to the deck list, to the official top 8 coverage video that includes an interview with Jarrod in there as well. And you've got 2 matches, is that right?
Yeah, so the top 4 and the finals I'm on stream for.
Yeah, and your interview was in
between those two.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. So I'll put a link, I think, just to a timestamp in the video of the start of your interview, but then if you want to watch the matches, you can just either go, if you want to watch the semi-final, it's immediately before the interview and the final was immediately after. And there's also a link to an official article as well about this deck as well. It's a very long video. Obviously it's a couple hours, and part 2 is a bit shorter, but it's still really long. It's very much intended to be more like a podcast format that you would listen to in the background whilst you do something else. If you do want to watch the video, what I've done is I've put in some footage of myself playing the deck. I actually played it in the most recent online sorcery league, and I went 6-2 with it, and I made the top cut, but I really suspect I didn't play that great. I certainly could have played better. I just made various suboptimal plays throughout, and I hadn't really played the deck at all much through the testing. It was pretty much just always Jarrod playing it, and I was playing against it. So I did try to apply some of what I learned, but like I said, I'm sure I've made various misplays. And what we've done is I've given Jarrod a bunch of the videos of me playing the deck, and he's picked out a few of these where there's some good examples of these suboptimal plays, and when these do happen, comments will appear on the screen from Jarrod detailing the more optimal play. It is a pretty difficult deck to play well, so hopefully these points should do a good job of illustrating by example various points that we discuss about the deck. It's definitely a deck that it almost doesn't have any matches where it just auto loses just because of the matchup. You're pretty much always in with a shout to win as long as you play good enough and you correctly identify the lines of play in advance of them happening and play optimally. You pretty much can win just about any match, and because of that, it's like an incredibly consistent deck for someone who's incredibly skilled at playing it. Is that fair to say? Something like that?
Yeah. I think that seems pretty on point.
And that's kind of what ultimately sort of one of the reasons why you were drawn to the deck, right? So it's like you didn't really sort of get just unlucky through bad draw. You didn't just sort of lose because of random bad things happening, pretty much, right? Like you generally were in control of your destiny, provided you played well enough.
Absolutely, that's very much my play style in all games. Like, it doesn't have to be the most powerful, but I value consistency very highly, which led to a lot of the choices in the deck of actual cards as well.
Yeah, so I think with that, we'll just jump into it. Why don't we start with what you didn't play, and we'll just have a quick talk about other decks that were considered, that were tested, and ultimately why you opted against them. Like, what were the reasons why you ended up not wanting to play those, as a segue into talking about the actual Geomancer deck that you did play.
Alright, so first, the main thing we were testing was Death Speaker. It was just, incredibly strong until Earth Sorcerer came along, Earthfire Sorcerer, and it made the matchup quite difficult. So we just end up slightly moving away from it. And even the whole time we're testing Death Speaker, there was a lot of testing of Pathfinder, and it's just sort of Pathfinder and the mid-rangey control sort of decks that suit me a lot better as a player. And then the Deathspeaker deck got much worse as soon as there was Fire Sorcerer, so we ended up pushing that to the side. We still tested a bit against it quite a bit, because we still thought it'd be a reasonable amount of the meta. And then, the Pathfinder the first version I tried was just an Earth Air sort of mid-rangey deck, and it was pretty reasonable. When you actually got the right thresholds, it was very strong, but the issues of one site, made the mana base very inconsistent, and there was probably about 20% of games where you just had the wrong thresholds for the cards in hand, and that's not my style. I prefer being very consistent. And I also tried like a water air Pathfinder version, which was like heavy on the spirits, so the evil presence, but again, same issues as the earth air version, just nowhere near consistent enough. We tested a reasonable amount of Enchantress just to get a feel for how the matchup plays out, mostly, but that also pushed it into the consideration of playing it. But at the end of the day, once I moved to the Geomancer version, and it did incredibly well into Enchantress, even when most of your cards, like all your berry effects, are very dead against them. So when you have quite a few dead cards in your deck and you're still winning, like almost 100% of games, it sort of makes the deck feel quite strong. So moved through to Geomancer. There's an honorable mention to trying to make some mono water decks work, but just not quite powerful enough in the end.
Yeah, I think when we were testing the water air spirits deck, I was getting the feeling that you were liking that one. But
yeah, it was quite a bit. And then there was the thing that pushed me away from the deck immediately was once you played a site under my ghost ship and it doesn't trigger, and that was very much core to the deck, being able to do some very powerful things with ghost ship, and I was just immediately like, yeah, this is, well, there goes the most powerful thing you can do in the deck, so let's try something else.
Yeah, I mean, it was also, as I think we identified pretty early on, I think maybe it was about a month before it came into the meta everywhere, we identified that Imperial Road was super powerful, and then once that came into the meta, like, that's really bad for Pathfinder as well.
Yes, that was another reason what pushed Pathfinder that little bit further away, which Geomancer can deal with quite well.
Yeah. Why don't we talk about the Geomancer deck a bit more? Why don't we just talk about, just at a high level, sort of what type of deck it is, how it sort of works, and how you approach the game in regards to just the general, I mean, generalizing, obviously it's going to be different on a match-to-match basis, but just at a conceptual level, how it goes about winning. Because I think when your semi-final, final were live streamed, I was watching it, and a lot of the people in the store that were watching it, they were a bit, I don't know if confused is the word, but they were a bit baffled as to how your deck even wins, it seemed. And I think it's just, a lot of the cards that they were sort of suggesting, I think there was just a bit of a conceptual sort of, at a conceptual level, it's not a very aggressive deck at all. Like,
no, it's not an aggressive deck at all, but it it's basically like a mid-range control deck. It just plays, has like a very stable early game through your sites. The sites are a massive part of why this deck works. Outside of the roots combo, like the Holy Grounds and then the 7 villages, they act like Holy Grounds quite often in the early game. They just really get you through the early game on quite a high life total, and then you just start playing fatty after fatty while also just controlling the board. Because Cave In, almost every time you play it, just feels like another Earthquake. And Earthquake, we worked out quite early, was probably one of the most powerful cards in the meta, along with Root Spider. But yeah, the deck, basically, it just plays out very control-y in the early to mid game. And then you sort of just get over the line with massive value from your sites acting like spells.
I mean, Cave In is, as you say, it's really strong, but it's a card that we don't see it very much in any of the deck lists we were looking at. We didn't see it. I don't think I saw it at all during the tournament.
Yeah, I think Yeah, I think I might have been. I didn't get to see many other matches playing because it's not a fast deck, so you generally don't win super quick. But if you're playing a reasonable pace and you're against any of the more aggressive decks, the games end very quickly because they very rapidly run out of cards. And then and they have to almost... A big part of the way we constructed the deck was that all of your cards, they generally get 2 cards worth of value from your opponent outside of like the Stone Gaze Gorgons, because if they get lightning bolted, when they don't get lightning bolted, their effect just locks down a very large part of the board and makes life for your opponent extremely difficult. That was one very underrated card in the meta that we almost never see. I think it probably deserves a little bit more love.
Oh, absolutely. I remember when we were testing this deck, and it's like, well, why don't we try this? And then you tried it, and it was like, almost like the first time it hit the board, it's like, this is just going to be in the deck. It was just obvious. Like it just, like you said, it just locked down a big section of the board, and it just felt like from the moment it hit the table, it was just game over if you couldn't remove it.
It actually came into the deck from when we were testing the draft portions, and I had it in one of my draft decks, and it was just like absolutely amazing and just wins the game single-handedly by itself.
Yeah.
So it's like, I think definitely worth a try, and it turned out it was very good. There are games where it doesn't do heaps, but they're normally the games that you're winning, so it doesn't matter. And when you combine them with a Root Spider, it just makes life for your opponent almost impossible to play out the game without a lightning bolt. Because a lot of the direct fire burn, you can position in such a way that it doesn't ever kill it. So it's always just lightning bolt, basically, or a berry effect. But if they use a berry effect on your Gorgons, you're happy because you have, like, everything in your deck is a good berry target.
I know when I was playing this deck, it feels weird a lot of the time, because you'll have like 8 sights out, you'll have 8 mana or something, and you'll have like 6 cards in your hand, and you can play all of them, and yet it's just like, yeah, I passed the turn. I don't do anything. And you do that 3 or 4 turns in a row, and you go on to win the game after that. But it feels really weird to be able to have so much mana and be able to play so many cards, and yet what you're supposed to do is not cast anything, and that can be quite often.
It is a very reactive deck in that sense, but it does also have like a certain curve against some decks where you just play fatties from 3 all the way up to 8, and you just win, and it feels like a completely different deck. But that's not the aim of how to win.
So we did.
And then sorry, I was just going to say, it's not actually a Roots deck, but we ended up moving to Roots over free cities, just because because you go so wide on your lands, it was very easy to attack around the free cities, and you have no way to sort of funnel them into your free city. So, and the Roots Sinkhole combo, it's just free in the deck. Like, it's just so easy, and you recover incredibly fast after a Roots. And even if you don't Roots, the Sinkholes are incredibly strong in the deck quite often, because you just curve out and they don't ramp up to anywhere near the amount of lands you do. And quite often you'll Craterize and Sinkhole in the same turn, and then all of a sudden they're back down to 3, maybe 4 sites, and you're still quite high on sites, and you can recover much faster from blowing up your own sites as well.
Yeah, I think the Roots in particular, it definitely, over the free cities, right? It took the deck to another level, really. Like, it was already pretty strong, and then it was just to another level.
The Roots in the longer games where you actually get to do it like consistently, because in like an aggressive matchup, you might do it maybe 1 out of 6 or 7 games, and it just instantly wins that game. But in the longer games against like Enchantress and just other various control decks, you'll get it off majority of your games, because you'll go through, at least 10 of your lands, and if any of them are Crossroads, then you've almost seen your whole deck. If you mulliganed, 2 sites, and you played a Crossroads, you've seen almost all your Atlases between drawing lands, replacing lands, land surveyors. You will hit it against the matches you need it, because they can go very long.
And I know when we were testing, because we were we'll do another probably talk about this, but the way that we approached it, we were very transparent. Like, we were sort of just always discussing what were in our hands, and sort of almost like we were both playing both of the decks. When we were going for
optimal plays basically on every turn from both sides to get the best possible testing.
And I know when we were sort of I was very much like, it's like you're in control of the game with the deck and you're probably going to win anyways, but it's like if you do the roots, I'm 100% sure that there's no way back for this other deck. Like, it just can't. Just the speed at which this recovers because of the Geomancer. I mean, it has massive synergy with Geomancer. Like, absolutely. Yeah. Like, it's crazy the synergy that it has. I mean, I know that there's other roots decks that use other avatars in other ways, but I don't think they,
it's also the thing with all those other roots decks is they try to roots and then just play a bunch of things and then try and kill you on board. This deck can do that if you have Bedrocks in play, or even if you just use the roots and then replace one of your lands after, you can get a threshold and then play some things. But it's very much just a roots whenever it feels right to do it, even if you play nothing else after. There was games where I was playing things before roots just to get my roots unlocked, like in the finals when I played a Atlas Wanderers to remove it from under a Atlantean Fate so that I could pop it. I didn't play anything then, but over the next few turns, I just completely flooded out my mana base, because if you have no Bedrocks in your starting like adjacent 4, you just the next 4 turns are just replace. If you ever have sinkholes after a roots, like your other sinkhole, it just becomes incredibly oppressive for them as well also.
Yeah, I think we started talking about some specific cards, but it was, I think, what our plan going into this was to just quickly talk about every single card in the deck and why it's there. So maybe that makes sense to do now, and we can just do a bit more of a brief discussion for the ones that we've already partially covered.
Yeah.
I think one thing, we'll start with the Avatar, I think, and just in particular, maybe just talk about the actual initial site placements and how you go about that, because it's really important to get those initial plays right, both in terms of just making sure that you optimally do the sort of optimal rubbles and make sure that they're not filling in your rubbles and that type of stuff, but also just a bit of nuance about maybe which sites you're prioritizing playing or mulliganing over other sites, to sort of like what you're looking for in those initial sites. And
so your optimal turn line is always a village, creating a guy, and then creating the rubble directly in front of you, because on your turn 2 you always need to replace that one, because otherwise your opponent can just play their own site there, and then you never get that value. From turns 3 and onwards, it's majority of the time it's from the row in front of you on the left on 3, and then make a rubble on the back, and then on the right on 4. Left and right is only depends on where your opponents place their sites, and then you can replace on 5, 6. Sometimes you'll replace on 4 if they're not pressuring your back sites through potentially Fury Roads or anything like that. Often what I would end up doing is, if I would try and use villages to fill out my curve, and if I didn't have one in hand and say on turn 4 I was playing an Autumn Unicorn, I would often try and replace from the top to try and hit a village. There are some awkward replaces you can hit. If, say, potentially you get like a sinkhole in the back line and then a roots in the back line on the other side, it's not optimal, but there are many ways to get around it, like through Atlas Wanderers, and sometimes even earthquaking your own backline if you're desperate to do the combo. But the deck wins majority of its games even without popping the roots. So quite often you don't even need to worry about it being in the backline.
And does that mean that you're typically mulliganing any sites that don't have an earth threshold, or are there some sites that you do keep that don't have an earth threshold in your opening hand?
So the only site I generally mulligan that doesn't have an Earth Threshold in my opening hand is Crossroads, because it gets a quarter of the value of just playing it anytime you mulligan it. Anyway. And then I will generally keep Roots and a Sinkhole, especially if they're together. In that case, if you have both of them, you generally have to play... You generally have to draw a site within your first couple of turns if you don't have a Land Surveyor, just to try and hit the extra thresholds. And it'll almost be, if you already have a Roots and a Sinkhole, it's almost guaranteed it'll be a Earth site. It gets a little bit awkward if it's a Crossroads, but you would have had one Earth site, so you've already got the one rubble in front of you, and then when you replace that, it's quite likely that you'll already be getting towards your next Earth site, like guaranteed, because there's 15 in the deck anyway. And if you hit a Mirror Realm after your first land, you can always copy your original site and get the Earth Threshold that way to make the rubble.
And are there any sites that have the Earth Thresholds that you typically would always mulligan?
Not really. I was mulliganing Earth Thresholds. The only time that would really come up is if I had more than one village in my opening hand, because they're incredible on turn one, and then they generally lose a bit of their value past turn one if you're curving out. If you're not there, they're very good if you're not curving out. And Holy Grounds against other control decks, you could potentially mulligan those, but they are incredible against any kind of aggressive deck, and a big part of why the deck actually does so well. Because we originally created it to be very strong against Earthfire Sorcerer, because we thought it was going to be a very large part of the meta, and it's incredible against those decks. You would always keep a Bedrock because it's just solid, but I would consider mulliganing a Bedrock if I had 2 and no village, because you really need to village on turn 1. It is very important for just how the gameplay generally works out. Like, quite often you will village, make the guy on turn 1, and then it will just sit in your back row for the next 5 or 6 turns until it's actually needed. Because you generally, unless you have the incredible aggressive fatty curve, you're generally not attacking super early unless the board is like very clear and you don't need to be being defensive.
Crusade. Let's move on through the deck list then. So
sure.
Let's talk about Crusade. Why that one's in the deck.
This one is one that I was actually considering cutting for a while. Just because we were looking for room just to try and make room for more cards. And originally it was Land Surveyor, because we did not originally have 4 in the deck, but it just became more and more apparent that I would probably play almost up to 7 Land Surveyors if I could play Land Surveyors. They are incredible for the deck. But it ended up making a cut. It's very strong against any other deck that's playing the same creatures, because you just win all your trades. And then there is the games where you drop a Titan on their face and it feels very, very strong.
I mean, it also obviously has some synergy with the Conqueror Worm. I don't know if you ever got it off, but...
No, didn't. But I would also, going forward with this deck, I don't think I would play Conqueror Worm. Sure. I think the Scourge Zombie, after I sideboarded it into the top 8, just really showed how much better Scourge Zombie is than Conqueror Worm in almost all scenarios.
And it had, the Crusade has a lot of obviously synergy with the Foot Soldiers and the Border Militia to get the Foot Soldiers.
That too. It also has incredible synergy with Root Spider. Just being able to turn off their minions on their own sites is very strong.
And it allows your Root Spiders to kill their Root Spiders as well, which is something that we were extremely mindful of, because we felt that Root Spider was more basically the most powerful creature in the game, pretty much, right?
Like, yeah, pretty much. That's why there's a Cave Trolls in there to fetch with common sense, just for the Root Spider battles.
So it was another solution to the roots to you being able to basically just have your your root spiders just straight up kill their root spiders, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So it was partial for that as well. And obviously you can drop your... there's a lot of other mini synergies throughout. It isn't just the Conqueror Worm, right? It's like also the Gorgons is kind of awesome. The Atlas Wanderer is potentially...
Yeah, the Atlas Wanderer is very big for sure.
But it's obviously just generally a pretty... Crusade is just pretty strong. It's a pretty strong card.
Absolutely. And that is a big part of this deck is every card needed to feel strong on its own, and that was a big reason why there's no cores and terrors in this deck, which is what a lot of people would assume why they should be in there. But there's certain draws where every time you draw a card, it needs to be impactful, because you have no card draw, so you almost always want to be drawing a spell. You very rarely draw a sight, and if you can draw spells that aren't impactful, it feels incredibly bad. There's maybe one card in the deck that is that card, and that is the Hounds, but that was very much a meta call. Because there's no Chaos Twister, we expected a lot of infiltrates, and I did pull off the common sense for Hounds against infiltrates, but in most other tournaments I think the Hounds would not be in the deck.
Sure. But I mean, just generally, right, all of your... Obviously, it's mono Earth. You have 24 Earth minions. You've got 7 villages, is it? You've got Border Militia. It's just like... Just generally speaking, the Crusade just adds sort of... It has a reasonably, like... I say reasonably, like a really high level of synergy, just generally, right? Because you have so many minions, potentially. For sure.
I should say the reason why I was considering cutting it is to make the disenchants that a lot of people were playing just completely useless. Like, sure, there's still the Orb, but it's generally with the Orb. The Orb is the third Divine Healing most of the time, and if I cut it from the deck, it would have to be the third Divine Healing. But there's most games where you play the Orb and then you just play a Divine Healing on the same turn, and then if they have to step up, sometimes even multiple squares, because you generally play it to your right, you don't play it on yourself. If they have to take 2 steps and they are not playing cards like Blink or things like that, then it feels not so bad that they had to take 2 steps to disenchant it. But at the end of the day, the Crusade was just more powerful than that being a scenario that mattered as much as just dropping a Crusade and potentially winning the game off of it.
Sure. Let's talk about the Orb, I think, next. Seems this we started talking about it a bit. Might as well finish that conversation off.
Yeah, for sure. This is another card that I was umming and ahhing about a bit, but it was... The deck in general is very strong against anything aggressive. So you definitely have a lot of time to do powerful things. And originally it was the second Conqueror Worm, but there was enough games where the Conqueror Worm just didn't feel impactful. So we tried out the Orb, and it has some very strong synergies in the deck. And it is a big reason why the Gigantism actually stayed in, because it can create some very unexpected lethals. But it's also incredibly strong with the Common Sense, because the first Common Sense you play goes and gets the other Common Sense and then a spell to play with it. And then the next turn, you can either double Common Sense again, or you can just start playing your powerful cards that you're getting with the Common Sense, like the Border Militia. And when you're doubling that up, it is very strong. Cave-In effectively turns into Earthquake once you have an Orb in play also. Craterize becomes a one-shot from max life. Earthquake obviously becomes basically... do the whole realm. And yeah, again, it is like the third copy,
well, right? And I know in our testing, one thing that there was a lot of games where it was like you were on the back foot with this deck, you're on the back foot with this deck, and then on the same turn it's just like Orb, Divine Healing, gain 14 life, just on the same turn because you had 6 or more mana. And
yes,
I think that, and I guess with Common Sense you could do it at the same time quite often as well, but I think once the orb's on the table, they can expect craziness, right? Generally speaking.
Yeah.
But before it's on the table, it's really difficult to just expect somebody to gain 14 life out the blue. Like,
for sure.
From the sort of when you're planning out lines of play, how you're going to get them to death's door, and just sort of making decisions. It's almost impossible to, sort of plan any sort of game strategy around them just gaining 14 life in a turn. It makes it like it's really an oppressive amount of life gain for any deck that's sort of extending itself into this deck, because if you're extended into it, you've got so many ways to just punish them pretty hard for overextension.
Absolutely.
Land Surveyor, you were singing their praises that you would want 7 if you could.
Yeah, they originally, when I first started playing with them, I thought they might feel a little bit awkward because you're already replacing so many lands and you might not need the sites, but just the way the game would end up dragging out. Most games that you play a Land Surveyor onto, you just feel very happy about, and you feel like you're going to win. They have the synergy with Crusade and the general Mortal synergy, but just there's no other early game drop that feels quite as strong for this deck as Land Surveyor. Through our testing, I was generally finding that the Craterize, you'd always have to draw between at least 1 to 2 sites a game for your Craterize and just you're generally curving out. Some games you got to do it with your Avatar, just by tap drawing after turn 6, and that felt fine, but it also did slow you down a bit. And then once the Roots combo was brought into the deck, it really felt like just drawing an extra site never felt bad. It gives you a lot more options. It helps you dig for your very powerful Roots combo, or even in some matchups your Pillar, because Pillar of Zeiros is quite strong. Especially if the game goes quite long, it'll be a full heal. And because there's so much small amount, it's very hard for them to get you to death's door in any meaningful speed. So the Pillar obviously becomes quite strong.
Yeah, I mean, also you just generally with the lands, it's not just those, right? Also, you're happy to see a Bedrock, especially even if you have might have the Roots combo already, right? So you're happy for the Bedrock. Sometimes just a random Sinkhole can remove some of the thresholds. Like, there's almost...
It is also another minion that if you only have one Bedrock and you pull off the Roots combo, I had it a couple of times where I pulled off the combo and then I just dropped a couple of Land Surveyors and they were just put on pressure. They went ending the game incredibly quickly, and you're probably going to win anyway, but they help just refill very quickly.
Yeah, okay. I mean, they'll draw the sites, but I guess at that point it doesn't... I guess you're just replacing anyway, right, for the most part.
Yeah, but it's only for the first 4, and if any of your first 4 are Bedrocks, then it's only like, maybe 2 or 3 that you get to replace.
Sure.
And then they can do some very serious business, but that's they're not intended to be the late game plays, but at no point in the game do they feel bad, even after like you're winning in a Roots combo. They also have like a lot of synergy with like the King of the Realm and the Crusade, so they can actually do meaningful damage. And quite often, against a lot of the decks that have no healing themselves, just a few points of chip damage here and there adds up. Especially when you have the Gigantism and the Craterize to push them to death's door. The early chip damage is relevant.
Yeah, well, the early blockers, right? Similar
that too.
I guess the
villages
being like mini holy grounds type of thing. But I guess, to sort of summarize or paraphrase all of that, I think the Land Surveyor, generally speaking, is we sort of consider that generally pretty strong. Anyways, just in any normal deck, pretty much. Like we considered it like I don't know, S tier, but definitely A tier card, I would think. And
yes, that was it, from the earlier discussion about Pathfinder. That was one of the things that hurt with playing Pathfinder was not being able to really play Land Surveyors because they didn't really do anything. But after playing Death Speaker, it was very much I really like this card.
And in this deck, though, the Land Surveyors in particular, I think they are S tier because they they don't have the problem of like they don't feel good at certain parts of the game, right? Like in all decks, they feel great as a turn 2 drop, but in this deck, just because it can get you the card for the Craterize, so it feels good for that. It can get you help you get the Roots combo if you need it, or if you've already got it, it can help you find something that's going to recover from the Roots combo faster, or you can play it after you Roots combo to recover faster. I think between the Craterize and between the Roots combo, and also generally just being really good early game, I think it means it's got a place. Like it's good early game, it's good mid game, it's good late game in this specific deck, right? Like it just absolutely has value throughout the whole game, and I think that's why you're saying you'd play 7 pretty much if you could, just because it's like
there was
so strong.
There was quite a few games that just common sense for a land surveyor came up, and it was just a strong play. Even on turn 4 as a 4-drop.
The poor old Scent Hounds that we bashed a bit, that we thought was we thought it was super tech when we first discovered it, and then about at some point before the actual tournament happened, it started popping up into common sense packages in Decklist Online, so it sort of became a sort of a generally discovered thing. But we thought we were onto some super secret hidden tech when we sort of came up with it however many months ago.
It did last. It lasted as an unknown thing for about 3 months, I think it was.
Yeah, okay.
And then, but yes.
But eventually
which is understandable, because the other formats had Chaos Vista, whereas this one didn't. So, which was a big reason that we included it, because we thought a lot of people would just be making Chaos Vista into infiltrates or like some similar, and Scent Hounds was incredible against infiltrate.
Yeah.
But in most tournaments, I think it is probably just better off being a Scourge Zombies.
I mean, Infiltrate was just generally in a weird place as well, right? Because it got that nerf on the rules update. Or card had a errata, so it got a nerf, but then because Chaos Twister, like in our format, it was removed, and like you're saying, we thought that would be sort of make Infiltrate more prominent, but it kind of just didn't turn out that way, really, in the tournament that we played in. There were some Infiltrates, but it kind of wasn't everywhere. And this super secret Scent Hounds tech that wasn't actually that secret at all by the time the tournament happened. It also might be why the Infiltrate wasn't that prominent, right? Because people that were playing may be a bit afraid of the Scent Hounds tech. So yeah, those poor Scent Hounds maybe were I don't know if you could call it a mistake, because I think the mistake really was that we incorrectly predicted that Infiltrate would be heavy in the meta, right? The mistake wasn't including the Scent Hounds. The mistake was, like, if Infiltrate was heavy in the meta, then Scent Hounds would have been a star, right? If you were playing against multiple.
Absolutely.
So I think as a takeaway for other people, it's more about, if you expect to play against a lot of Infiltrates, then that definitely should be in the deck list, right? But if you're not,
for sure,
it probably should be cut.
Yep, sure.
The Autumn Unicorns,
they're just incredible. They're so much bigger than basically anything people can be playing at that spot in the curve. If you play them on 3, you just feel invincible. Like they're not hitting you that turn. And if you play them late, they're still good. There's games where you pop your Roots. If you have a Bedrock in play, you just replace your first sight, and then you can just jam a Unicorn, and they are in a very good clock after a Roots. And again, like I was saying with the early chip damage, if you get in maybe 2 hits with a Unicorn, you can Craterize to put them to death's door pretty easily. And they just win creature combat all early game.
Yeah, I mean, they're super strong, right? But for any deck that can comfortably meet that double Earth threshold requirement on turn 3 or maybe even 2, I mean, in this particular deck, it's going to be turn 3, right? And pretty much nearly all the time, especially with the that you would be mulliganing typically the non-Earth threshold sites, like nearly always you would be able to play it on turn 3 as well, just because it's a mono Earth deck, right? So if you can't play it on turn 3 in this deck, something has gone horribly wrong and you're in trouble. Yeah, it's a very, very I mean, we'll do a tier list at some point for cards, but for sure this is like right,
it would be
really
up there.
high, right? Like
Yes.
really, really high. There are cards, other minions that sort of cost 3 and have 4 power that are just straight up worse than this, that are also really good as well.
Most of if you think about it, almost all the other minions that cost 3 that have 4 power, they all have a drawback. This one's only drawback is that it's double Earth Threshold. And if you think about the ones in air, they all have double air threshold and they have a drawback. So it's a very strong card.
Yeah, and they're still playable, right? They're still perfectly
absolutely
reasonable cards, right? Whereas, I mean, that's a big thing as well. Just generally, I guess, is that in our testing, we pretty, I think, reasonably quickly concluded that Earth was just the most powerful. What's the term? Element, right? The most powerful element.
For sure.
So I think it's also got that going for it because it's super powerful. It's Earth, and then it also means that you get to play a bunch of other really powerful Earth cards if you're playing it because you need the Earth thresholds, right? So
yeah, there's definitely some more of those very powerful Earth minions down further in the list for sure. That we will get to.
It's also, just a quick shout out, it's also Daria's, my wife, it's her favourite card. Well, maybe not anymore. Maybe the Wolves is her favourite card now, but it was the Unicorn. The Cave Trolls, it's a bit another tech thing we came up with.
We did talk about it a little bit earlier, but it's 100% in there to fight root spiders, which we identified as possibly the strongest creature in the game. From all the testing we did, it felt like any deck that could run 3 root spiders, unless you had like a very specific reason not to, you just should. Mostly, well, not only because they're incredibly strong, but they're also one of the only real good ways to fight a root spider is with your own root spider and just trade them out. And then Cave Trolls just sort of gets to do that. You can common sense for it, and it kills spiders without dying.
Yep. Yeah, it's basically just there because of the power level that we've assigned to Root Spider, we just really, and I think also that it's a single Earth threshold, like you're saying. Every deck that could play it should, which basically means every deck that has any Earth thresholds in it should play it. And that combined with Earth being the most powerful element in our opinion, also with it being popular in the meta, right, with Fire Earth.
And also on top of the fact that because this deck is Earth, you don't particularly have ways to deal with Root Spider. It is Craterize or your own Root Spiders. So just having that little bit extra to deal with it is nice.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I think a big part of it, just for, I guess, it's like we keep talking about, because we felt it was so popular, all the decks that we were building and testing, all of our testing pretty much involved having to play into Root Spiders over and over and over again. So any deck that we ever built that couldn't properly deal with Root Spiders was just not a very strong deck as far as our testing gauntlet was concerned.
It also feel like anytime we were playing a deck that had Root Spiders against a deck that didn't have Root Spiders, the deck that didn't have them was just losing. Yeah. So
yeah, it almost feels like we'll keep. Yeah, maybe we tone down the Root Spider discussion a little bit. We'll see how we get to, because we'll have to talk about the Root Spider in a second. But yeah, it's almost like Root Spider deserves its entire video just for itself about all the things that we discovered in testing about it, because I think part of the reason why it's so powerful is because of a lot of sort of plays and things that you can do with it that maybe aren't that obvious to people as well, like just how the order that you move things and how you can like pin down locations, or how you can play it under your own creatures to protect them from being attacked, and so on and so forth. Like it has.
Should we move to Root Spider before we do Crown Prince, just to keep the conversation flowing?
Yeah,
because I understand why some people don't value Root Spider as highly as we do, especially in this deck. There is quite a few games where you just play a Root Spider and it just sits there for a good like 5 or 6 turns, and it feels like in a lot of decks it feels like maybe you should have been attacking or whatever. But in this deck in particular, if you have a Root Spider on your side of the board, every time I brought it up top to do any kind of attacking, I was always punished and I always felt bad, because if your Root Spider is sitting there doing nothing, you're winning the game. Because the longer the game goes, the more likely you are to win with this deck. Which is a big reason why all the villages, etc., all the healing is quite strong. And yeah, if your Root Spider is doing nothing, you've won. But if your Root Spider is locking down even one unit, you also feel pretty good.
Yeah, exactly.
And most of the time it is locking down something much bigger than itself.
Sure. Yeah. So, so in summary, it's almost like, in a way, if it's doing something, it feels good, and if it's doing nothing, it feels great.
Yes.
Which is, again, like, I know, again, having played this deck personally, it's another one of those things that is, I don't know if it feels awkward, but it's certainly, like, and you inferred to it as well. It requires discipline, right?
Yes, it's not a deck for everybody. Like, you have to have the control mindset where doing nothing is completely fine. So if you generally lean towards aggressive decks, this would not be a deck for you, because as Nick mentioned earlier, there's quite a few turns where just doing nothing is the correct play. And there was most of my games in the top 8, I would have 2 or 3 1/1s just chilling in my backline, and to a lot of people, they would have thought they were moving up and attacking with them would be the correct play, and quite often it's just not, because losing them to free to cards like Desert, or even just AoE damage, Novas and Major Explosions and things like that. It's just they do more if they're just sitting in play later. For a card, especially for a card we're about to talk about, which is Crown Prince.
Sure. So let's talk about the Crown Prince.
Yeah. So this card, in the original testing, it didn't feel like it did too much, but it was enough of an issue that it deserves its spot. And throughout the tournament, this was probably one of my MVPs. It did so much work. It generated so many cards, just through trading, or it very rarely just had to chump block things without taking down what it was attacking. And yeah, anytime because the game goes so long, you generally have so much mana spare anyway, and there is certain lines of play where if you hold. You have a bunch of removal in hand and you don't want to play any of it, you can just jam this guy down, and if he dies, it generally doesn't matter, because you've got your 1/1s in the back line, and they'll just bring him back to hand. And then you can just keep doing that, and they're losing cards each time they do it, and you're just not. And a big thing with this deck is it has no card draw outside of the Land Surveyors, which is another reason why they feel very strong, because there just isn't card draw in Earth. And this effectively feels like card draw, or card advantage at least.
Yeah, I think as well with, like you said, because in the early, this deck did evolve, right, throughout the testing process. So
for sure,
there's just been more mortals added, like the Land Surveyors, for example. The very original version of this list didn't actually have Land Surveyors, and they were put in, and then as soon as they put them in, there was no looking back. But yes, and Border Militia was in and out throughout, right, as well. So
correct, yeah.
And then also the Orb was in and out as well. So now that you've got the Land Surveyors, you've got an Orb that is potentially doing a double Border Militia. That's a lot of extra potential synergy for the Crown Prince as well, right? You pretty much always got a mortal on the board, just about. And then it's just a case of you manipulating the game state, right, to make sure that they're having to make bad trades effectively into your mortals and your prince.
Yeah.
Giving them all
absolutely.
And that's another reason why the Root Spider is even better, right? Because you can force the awkwardness effectively.
Absolutely.
You can turn off certain options to them. So the Royal Bodyguard, or Royal Bodyguards, sorry, there's 2 of them.
Yep. That's just another card. They're very when you read them, they seem just strictly worse than an Autumn Unicorn, but it is like playing another 2 Autumn Unicorns. But there are certainly a lot of scenarios that come up where you can drop them on or close to your Geomancer, and it makes it incredibly difficult for them to kill you in scenarios that end up very close. So there are games where they are much better than Autumn Unicorn, but there are certainly games where they feel like a worse Autumn Unicorn. But even a worse Autumn Unicorn is still a good. And at the 4 slot in Earth, there was a little bit of competition, but at the end of the day, all of the other Earth baddies at 4 have massive drawbacks when you can't, and if you can't get around them, then the Bodyguard just feels better. And then there's times where it has like an incredible upside, and it is also another mortal for the multiple mortal synergies in the deck, which doesn't hurt.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the ones you're particularly referring to is basically just the Phalanx and the Pudge.
Yes.
And it's basically they just have mobility issues, right? That this deck can't overcome those mobility issues. And I think the other thing I'm sure, I don't know if it happened. You can say if it happened at any point during the whole tournament, but this deck has a bit of bonus synergy with the Royal Bodyguard, right? Because it also has the King of the Realm, and it also has the Crown Prince, right? And also the Queen in the sideboard. So I don't know if you ever absorbed any damage or
no, that never really came up. But so the absorbing damage never came up, but I probably would have bounced the Crown Prince when it died, when there was a Bodyguard in play at some point.
Sure.
But I can't remember exactly.
Yeah, but I mean, even, I guess, the ability is highly relevant, basically. Like, it's... I don't know if highly is a word, but it's not some text that very rarely means anything. Like, it's relevant.
It makes it very hard for units to effectively attack early also, just because he's big, and if they're ever attacking for less than 3, it makes them very hard to make the attack. So that also does come up.
It might not be the case, but it might be the case. You can say, I guess, in your opinion, but I think even if that didn't have any text box, right, if it was just a vanilla 4-cost
I was going to mention that as well. It probably, I mean, yes, I think I would still play it, just because there is also no 4-drops in the curve for minions. There's only the Cave-ins and the Gigantism. And then sometimes you can play the Gigantism on a minion, like on one of your 1/1s, and just get a free kill on whatever they played on 4. But quite often you just want to be jamming a minion in that spot anyway. Or a play that came up very often on the 4 slot of the curve was just caving in on cores and Philowstones. But we can get to that when we get to the spells.
The Atlas Wanderers
are just absolutely incredible. They're in that Root Spider slot of potentially one of the best minions in the game. Their big drawback is that they're triple Earth Threshold, so a lot of decks just can't get away with playing them. And I think if they were 1 or 2 Earth Threshold, you would see them in majority of lists, because the ability to manipulate site placements is such a massive thing in this game. And they're huge, which is pretty nice.
Like a magical sort of threshold, really. Like
they're never not 2 for 1-ing unless they have a barrier effect. And quite often, you can also have the ability to put one of their sites in between quite a few of your sites for a border militia to make even more minions. There's also times when you get a Sinkhole in your backline, and then you just move one of their sites to in front of your avatar, and then you get 2 extra rubble when you blow it up to be able to replace with. There's quite a few powerful plays. And again, like in the finals when I moved my Roots from under a Atlantean Fate to win the game.
Yeah, so it's got bonus synergies basically with Sinkhole, with Roots, with Border Militia, in addition to just generally all sorts of stuff you can do from the movement, even without those direct synergies, right?
It's also, if there's times when you don't want to move sites, because it's not actually a maze, so you can always just target your Bedrock, and then the Bedrock can't be moved, so it's just a giant minion. And a 5-cost 5 power is not to be underrated. Like, it is it's a very powerful minion on the curve.
Yeah, I mean the is it the Amazon Warriors, right? They even pop up in. I mean they're playable, right? And they're
that was actually another card that we considered for the deck as like a one-off, just for like part of the common sense, just to have like a meaty minion to be able to go get. But at the end of the day, that was before the Stone Gaze Gorgons, so the 5 slot filled up pretty quick once we realized how powerful they were.
Yep.
Which is the next card. So yeah, it's certainly a card that sometimes it's just a 5 mana 3 power minion, which doesn't feel great, obviously, when you have like 3 mana 4 power minions in your deck. But the games where it is good, it is absolutely incredible. And the games where it's bad, they're the games that you're winning anyway, because they have nothing in play. The only drawback is the lightning bolt, like mentioned earlier, and that absolutely hurts. But there are some games when you can drop it on your avatar, and you get a lot of value there, or you just have like a 1/1 in the same square as it, and it's turned off, but it doesn't matter because it makes their lightning bolt a 50-50, which feels pretty good if they miss. Sure, there's games where they hit, and it feels unfortunate. And I think if you're playing in a tournament where you expected a lot of lightning bolts, I'm talking like 3 to 4 lightning bolts in, maybe in the decks of like maybe half the field, then yeah, you probably wouldn't play it. But we weren't expecting that. We were expecting a lot of Earthfire or things like that. So it's very strong against that.
Yeah, and you can obviously drop it on, if they have minions on your side of the board, right? You can just drop it straight onto
absolutely,
and then the 50-50 comes potentially killing their own thing.
Yep.
So just, I mean, in case it's not obvious, the minions at the same location are disabled because it's adjacent to. It counts under the adjacency rules. So, which
is another thing for the Geomancer. So after you pop roots, adjacent counts the square you're sitting in, which is why you get 4 replaces without having to move.
Yeah. The King of the Realm?
So the King of the Realm, originally it was just as like a strong card against Deathspeaker, because a lot of their minions are mortals. But it does have quite a lot of synergy as just being like another Crusade effect, with all your villagers and your surveyors, and obviously your Crown Prince. And yeah, there was, some games came up where I just played it as like a +5 effect and put people to death's door. But yeah, for the most part, it is there for just Deathspeaker and getting their come into play effects from their mortals.
I mean, you did. It was the game one of the final.
I was just about to mention that one. There was game 1 of the final when he was on death's door and he played a Grandmaster Wizard next to himself, and I just played King of the Realm and took it and killed him. That was made for a nice little highlight. I
mean, I don't know.
But it's definitely not why it's in the deck.
Or was it still in the balance before that happened?
Oh, I was definitely winning that game, and it was just like waiting to be able to kill him, but that just ended it quicker.
Sure, but yeah, it's still.
It was still a fun little play.
Yeah. And it does occupy. I mean, the 7 mana isn't really much of an issue for this deck. The Triple Earth threshold isn't really much of an issue, and there's so many mortals as well.
Yeah, a lot of the good minions are mortals, and if you're ever taking even just one of their minions, it feels like an incredibly powerful card. And there's quite a few times when they will have attacked with their mortals, and you just drop it, and then none of their mortals on tap because they're now yours. And then if they kill it on their own turn, it's like you just turned off all of their mortal minions for a turn as well.
Yeah.
One thing I always found with King of the Realm is I would always play him as far away from my opponent as possible. Sometimes that would mean playing it on my Avatar, on my Geomancer, just so that it was harder to kill with lightning bolts and thunderstorms. Other times it meant just jamming him in the corner of the realm, so it was harder for them to kill with like X step aways, like your major explosions or even heat rays and firebolts and things like that. But yeah, it's not an attacking minion. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, I guess he has that magical threshold that you want to breach, right? Like, you want things to be 4 like the unicorn, but he's only 3.
Yeah,
so he's not lightning bolt or thunderstorm proof.
Yeah, he's got the same problem with as Gorgons, but which he's in that boat of when he's good, he's absolutely amazing. But if he gets lightning bolted, it feels pretty bad.
Yeah, but it definitely was it's again another secret tech against something that didn't really end up being a thing. We thought their speaker would still be somewhat popular.
Yeah, I mean,
just wasn't anywhere much.
I did play Death Speaker once, and it's an incredibly good matchup for this deck. I was 2 turns off of killing him. He was on Death's Door. I was on 20, but we just ran out of time in the round. So it ended up being a draw.
Well, yeah, but in the tournament we played, if it was a draw, it counted as a loss for both players.
Yes, absolutely.
Unfortunately, so when you're checking the record, it's, I guess, yeah, your overall record was a bit
6-3.
tarnished,
it should have been,
I guess, because of that rule.
Yeah, a little bit, but at the end of the day, still got in there and went undefeated in the top 8.
Yeah. The Titan, the Wraetannis Titan. Hopefully, I've pronounced that correctly.
Yeah, it's Wraetannis Titan. He's just great. Like, he's incredible defensively. Like, if they're ever hitting you, because you just on any of your sites, he just kills whatever is in play underneath him. And if you ever get him off a Crusade, they take quite a lot of damage. There is some decks where, you like your Battle Mage or your Avatar of Earth, where they're already on your side of the board anyway, so you just get in quite a lot of damage for free, especially if they're an attacking, like Avatar of Earth, Battle Mage. You drop it on their face, pretty hard for them to move away to attack you again, because it can block in all the directions they can attack anyway. So quite often they're taking 12 damage from it, unless they have like a grapple shot or something. So yeah, it's quite a lot of damage. And yeah, and against the aggressive decks like Sorcerer, where they aren't on your side of the board, it kills. Like, even if they have one minion in one of your squares, just killing one of their minions and getting a giant minion is very strong.
Yeah, you get that immediate value is key, right? Like, so
yeah, absolutely.
Bury it or whatever on their turn, you
already got value
out of it.
Yeah.
You got to remove. You still 2 for 1 them basically, right?
And it's sort of still, if you're being completely defensive at that point, it feels like the same role as like the lands that heal or the villages, because it stopped one of their attackers for the next turn, and then it still made them spend mana on their next turn to get rid of it. And against a lot of decks that sort of stop at 4 to 5 lands, them spending half of their turn to bury it, or quite often maybe they have to earthquake it, because by that point they've probably gone through quite a lot of their barrier effects, or they have to spend multiple cards to deal with it. And if they're spending 2 to 3 cards to deal with something that's already killed one of their cards, and you're 4 for 1ing them with it, it feels incredible.
Yeah, I mean, it's also strike each enemy here, right? So it's also very possible that you get more card off it. Exactly.
And if they ever have multiple minions in the same square, it's incredible, but your deck has so many ways of being good against that situation anyway, that if they're doing that, you're probably winning anyway.
The Conqueror Worm.
Now, this is one that was in and out quite a lot. And if I played the tournament again, it wouldn't be in the deck. It's not bad by any means. It's huge. It does what you want it to do. Like, most of the time, the stealing of a site is completely irrelevant, but it is just very big. If I could play 2 Midland Armies, I 100% would, because that is the card that it's sort of being another copy of, just at the top of the curve. But from playing in the top 8, it just sort of felt like it would have been better if it was a Scourge Zombies, because there was quite a few games where I would have just liked to have been able to common sense for a Scourge Zombies, and they sort of fill the same late game role, apart from Scourge Zombies being a much lower clock. But at the end of the day, it didn't feel like I needed more of a clock. During some of our testing, it felt like I needed a more impactful card at the top end, but that was also at the same time when there was things to draw like the cores and the mixed terrors. So it's sort of like a leftover remnant from that area of testing, where just being that little bit lower on the curve probably would have been better.
Yeah, I mean, I think it has obviously the synergy with the Crusade, but it's not something that it's very, I mean, it's obviously not consistent to pull off at all. And then if you don't get that, then unlike the other high, like the Titan and the King of the Realm, where you potentially get a lot of value out of them, right? Even if they just proceed to just straight up just bury them or whatever on their turn. Yeah, this potentially just gives you 0 value, right? Like they just
that is a big part of it. It's a very expensive card that doesn't do something the turn it comes into play. So quite often, I mean, you'd hope at that point that you play it that they've used most of their ways to deal with it very easily, but it's, you know, there'll be games where that doesn't happen, and then they do, and it feels quite bad.
Midland Army.
Just overall, it's an absolute massive unit. It's really good at ending games once they're on death's door through its tap ability. It's just, tap ability is very strong even for controlling the board if you're in like a more defensive state. It definitely feels like one of the few units in the game where if they don't kill it straight away, you actually get to untap with it and have it in play for even just a couple of turns, it's very likely that you're going to win that game. It's not an easy unit to deal with either. Like if they're killing it straight through like size alone, it's going to get like, you know, between 2 and 3 cards from them easily, which is super powerful. And then they have to deal with the Death Rattle, which is going to be another couple of cards most of the time. It's obviously quite poor against Bury, because if it gets buried, you actually don't get the Death Rattle. Well, it procs underground and they all die straight away anyway. But by that point of the game, you hope they're very low on Bury effects, if you know, have like none at all, because just about every unit in your whole deck is a Bury target, because they're all so huge. It sort of only really competes with Conqueror Worm for a slot anyway, and it's in almost every scenario, it's just strictly better than a Conqueror Worm. And the one fringe case where it's not is if you have the Conqueror Worm and you have the Crusade out covering some of their lands and you just steal one of their lands straight away. It's pretty good, but even in that scenario, Midland Army is just as strong, because if they manage to kill it under there, which is quite hard to do already, all the minions that come out are now 2 power, and they're actually very threatening and generate quite a clock. They're good at just ending the game straight away. So even in that one fringe case, it's still probably better than a worm.
Yeah, I mean, unless they obviously bury it straight away, but it's...
But yeah, the worm's pretty bad in that.
Worm straight away, and I mean, I guess there's some super fringe case where you took the land that had the single Earth threshold, or they only had a couple lands and they can't cast a bury or whatever because of it. But it's, I don't know, it's just so fringe that... Yeah,
and the worm does have good synergy with like just dropping it and using sinkholes to get them down on lands pretty quickly. But overall, the army's just much better at ending the game.
Yeah, I mean, and the other thing as well is obviously that the Crusade is like clearly not going to always be out as well. This is the thing, right? Like, which one is better without the Crusade is a big question here, because that's probably going to be the case more often than not. So
it is always the worm, always the army in that case for sure.
And the main drawback of the army really is the quadruple Earth threshold, which just isn't an issue for this deck.
No.
So yeah, and it's like you're saying, it's like if you do get to untap with it because they couldn't kill it, like you're probably just going to go on to win the game at that point. I mean, it's
another thing that makes the Midland Army so good is if you have it in play when you blow up your roots, you generate quite a big clock afterwards as well, because you end up with so many minions in play also.
Yep. Yeah, and obviously you have the general model, like you could potentially getting the zombies back as well, right? When you and the 5 foot soldiers
Yeah, and it also has a great mortal synergy with all the other mortal synergies throughout the whole deck, because it's a mortal itself and it generates even more mortals when it dies.
Yeah, and so so I mean, partly it's obviously needs to self-justify its slot, but you're going to have the 8 drop in there regardless, because you can get to the 8 sites and you want something there, and it's every other card that you would conceivably have is already in the deck anyways. Like the Titan or whatever is the other top end stuff, you've already got it all anyway, right? So it's really just the only thing that it's really competing with is the Conqueror Worm. But it does do its thing that other cards don't do. Like, it gives you that incredible reach to just finish the game off if they're on death's door.
Yeah, and it's a late enough card that it's possible that they just don't have an answer when you play it, and they need an answer very quickly. Otherwise, it gets out of hand quite fast. Yeah,
absolutely. And I mean, to be clear here, the reason why they probably don't have an answer is because you probably played like a Titan the turn before that they probably also had to kill straight away, or they were going to lose the game. And
for sure,
you've got a bunch of other stuff in the deck that would have been played in earlier turns that they needed to also kill somehow, or they were going to lose the game. So they just run out of effects, and especially if you played a Titan the turn before, like whatever answer they had, they probably already used it. So even though it does just die to a barrier and earthquake, and it's bad, part of the skill of playing this deck is obviously trying to bait out those cards and be confident that they don't have any left in their hand when you play it. And if you think that they do have one, or you know that they do have one, to actually play something else first, to bait it out first before you play the Midland Army. So it's all just part of really, yes, those cards are obviously bad for the army, but a big part of this deck is effectively correctly identifying the lines of play and playing around it. So man, how do you say this? Using your skill, basically.
Yeah, I think it's that's pretty much it. Yeah, there's also even lines of play where if you expect them to have the berry, you can save it for when you're gonna blow up your roots and play it on the turn. Like, you play it before you blow up your roots, because you can't do it after because of the 4 threshold. But you blow up your roots, and then you generate a bunch of 1/1s and actually put on an even larger clock that they need to try and recover from. And if you ever have any zombies in the graveyard, it's even more of a threat.
Yeah, and that can obviously just combo well as well, like with other stuff, right? Like, you could have a Crusade in hand, for example, right? Do that and then dump the Crusade on them after, and then
that's a pretty strong play. Yes, that's a game over clock.
I think it's just, I don't know, it's easy to look at. On the one hand, you can look at Midland Army and say, well, if they bury it, it's not very good. And yes, that is true. If you just play it and they bury it and that's the end of the conversation, then yeah, it's not particularly good. But, a big part of playing the deck is just making sure that don't happen, and playing the game out in such a way to ensure that it doesn't, and seeing that like line of play, and seeing that whatever that may be to make sure that it doesn't happen. If that's, playing on the same turn that you're going to play the roots. And part of that would be, okay, so I drew the Crusade, so I'm not going to play it, right? I'm going to hold it back. I'm going to play the Midland Army. Then I'm going to, on the same time, I blow it with the roots, and then I'm going to play the Crusade afterwards. And that's not a very conventional thing to do, really, is it? To hold back a Crusade when you've got various things that you could be using to play on the board with it, and it's not a very conventional thing to like blow up your own 8-powered minion with the root, like put it down on the same time and blow it up. Like, that is not they're like unconventional things to do that, they're not necessarily like totally, like, it's not like blowing up your own Midland Army with the root. Like, playing it and blowing it up straight away is like plan A, but it's an option. It's something that can be done, and that's vastly superior to just putting it down and then burying it the next turn.
Yeah, it's if you make the read that they are sitting on a barrier effect, it's just a good way to get around that.
So it's just, I think it's easy to, like, it's a card with a lot of upside, and yeah, sure, it has some downside, but it's to some degree that a big chunk of that downside can be mitigated, I guess, right? In summary, is what we're really saying here.
Absolutely. It's also just the deck in general is just so good at being very mid-rangey that it at the end of the day, you still win most of your games without even drawing it or ever playing it. So it's not like you actually need it to win. So it dying with no value isn't the worst thing in the world.
Yeah, it's the best top end drop pretty much in the deck, though, right? You think? Or
absolutely, yeah.
It's just.
I mean, it's competing with Craterize because, as I said before, like Worm is not it, and it should just be a Scourge Zombies at the end of the day. It competes with Craterize, and it's probably better than Craterize. They do slightly different things. It's better if you're in a winning state than Craterize, whereas Craterize, if you're on the back foot. But yeah, Craterize can get you out of some sticky situation.
Sure. Did you want to talk about Craterize the next then, or you want to go through the cards in order of the deck list?
We can go through the
Divine Healing.
Let's just go through. Yeah, just keep going through the spells, I reckon. Common sense, yeah. So it's Divine Healing. Divine Healing is pretty much what you expect. It's got good value with the Orb, like I mentioned earlier. If I wasn't playing Orb, you'd think you'd probably have to play 3. But it feels great being able to get away with only playing 2 because there are some matchups where you really don't need the healing because you have so much from your sights already, and just throughout like the game you don't lose that much damage from all your blockers and all etc. like that. But it is in the matchups that it's good, it is very good. And if you ever pull it off with Orb, it's almost impossible for aggressive decks to kill you.
I mean, maybe we can just talk about life gain a bit generally, because it was something that very early on in our testing we just identified as being extremely powerful, right? Compared to Magic the Gathering, where it's basically just pointless. In Sorcery, life gain is an extremely powerful effect, and I think that's just because just the way that the game plays, right? Like in Magic the Gathering, you can block up the board state pretty easily, whereas they get you down to 1, but they can't do the final damage, right? Because they can't attack you or get that damage through. But in Sorcery, it's just about impossible to do anything with the board state to make it so that they can't attack any of your sites for 1. So
yes, especially in a deck that goes so wide on the board.
So the life gain is just inherently a much more powerful effect, pretty much, in Sorcery, right? And it's
for sure.
We also tried other cards as well. I mean, Angel's Egg was something that you were running that in your Pathfinder decks, right? And
yeah.
That was just like a star of the show pretty much in so many matches, and it did end up in the meta again. That was another one that was probably 3 months, right, after we identified that it was super strong, like that. And eventually it came through into the meta. I think Divine Healing already sort of existed a bit all along, to some degree, but it's for those that haven't played Sorcery a lot and mostly come from a Magic the Gathering background, just really trying to emphasize that life gain is actually a big deal in this game compared to
it's quite strong compared to being almost useless in other games.
And essentially it's, I guess there was a bit of a question about why not 3, why 2, why not 1, and it's just
the big reason behind 2, or I suppose we can go from 1 to 2. So 1, it felt like for me specifically, it felt like I'm not a huge fan of singleton of like 1-Oz unless you can either tutor for them or they're unique and you can only play 1. Because it feels like when you play 1, you don't see them when you need them enough. With 3, in this deck in particular, to be fair, quite a few other decks, when you draw them when you don't need them, it can feel a little bit rough. But this deck in particular, you just don't need 3. Because you have 3 Holy Grounds, you have the Pillar, you have your 7 villages that sort of act like the heals as well. And then you just have so many early minions that you really don't need like as much healing in this deck as you would think. And then there's obviously the Orb that sort of plays like the third one quite often, where you just play drop Orb and play it on turn 6, and then all the way back up to 20, and then any deck that has gotten you down to the point where you need to do that play they're not putting you on death door after that.
And the triple Earth threshold obviously is an issue for lots of other decks, but
just not this one. Yeah,
which is another reason why running 3 can feel real bad in other decks, just because not only
you just can't cast them.
Yeah, and I guess another thing is it's like if you run 3 versus 2, obviously there's way more chance that you also end up with 2 of them in your hand when you can't use them, which feels like you said, it feels really bad to have 1, but it feels really, really bad like when you have 2 in such a situation. The common sense.
So I think the big discussion, obviously Common Sense is just an incredibly powerful card, especially in Earth, because there is so many particularly like good ordinaries that you can just play one of, or even just like the good ones that if you don't want to get your other cards, you can just get one of your good Land Surveyors and you feel great about it anyway. But in this deck in particular, I think the real question is why 2, why not 4? Or 3 even. And the original, before the Land Surveyors were in the deck, I was playing definitely 3, sometimes 4, because it felt like you just wanted something down your curve a little bit more to be able to do. And then once the Land Surveyors came in, that was the thing, and that felt way better than ever playing an early Common Sense. And it sort of came down to 2 just because we needed room for thing. At the end of the day,
most things to Common Sense for, right? So you end up with 3 or 4 Common Senses, but then nothing to actually search for.
Yeah, and I think a big thing to mention here with the Common Senses is that the Disenchant isn't in the deck like most Common Sense packages would have. And at the end of the day, I just came down to feeling like there's a few situations where a Disenchant would feel nice, and it's mostly Atlantean Fate on your or Atlantean Fate only really works against your roots and your sinkholes in this deck. Everything else is either like a Bedrock or a Village, or it's like a Crossroads where you didn't care about the threshold anyway. So, but the deck also has enough ways around Atlantean Fate doing things against those, like with the placement, like the Wanderers and the Earthquake being able to move out of it. It's like even that scenario was like not quite good enough to bother with it. And the other one is Enemy Crusades. And just at the end of the day, I felt like it's not going to come up often enough that my opponent has a Crusade that I want to do it to. So it's like it didn't feel that worth playing, because you never want to move up really. Stepping with your Geomancer always feels wrong in this deck, because you want to be hitting your land drops, and if you're not hitting a land drop, you really want to be drawing a sight with your Avatar. So you don't want to move to kill things on their side of the board. And then for almost everything else, you have cave-ins, berries, and earthquakes. Sure, if doesn't feel quite as nice if they have water sites, but there's so few decks actually playing water sites that it didn't really come up enough that it was worth the games where you draw it and you can't play it. And that felt really bad. So at the end of the day, it was just all about consistency. And I moved it to the sideboard just in case there was like those situations were in decks in the top 8 that I would want it, or they were playing Enchantress, which I played in the finals. And it's nice. It's just nice to have against that, because they play their side close enough that you can blow them up anyway.
That's a big... we didn't really cover this, but it's a big part of the reason why this deck is so strong, right? And why Earth is so strong in general is because water is so weak.
Yes.
If water was prominent in the meta, then I don't know if this deck... I wouldn't go as far to say that it's not viable, but it certainly doesn't look exactly the same, right? And there's a lot of cards that just lose so much value. Like, all of the berry effects just become...
They become like you can only really use them on your side, right? And same with Root Spider. Like they become completely defensive cards as opposed to potentially aggressive cards.
So you think it's just...
And if water was a thing in the meta, maybe the sideboard would be completely different for a start. But in tournaments that don't have a sideboard, I mean, potentially if it was a big enough part of the meta, you either wouldn't play it, or there's possibly things that we haven't looked at that would be good against it. But again, it was such a small, insignificant part of the meta that we really didn't bother with it.
Yeah, I mean, we were very much getting the feeling. I mean, obviously people can, run their homebrews or come up, there was absolutely going to be some water decks there, but I think we were just, one eye on making top 8 and the other eye on trying to win top 8 when you get there, right? So really we're just thinking that it's outside
and I think
the Enchantress deck that is there's probably nothing.
I think at the end of the day, the only deck in the top 8 that had water sites, I think there's only one deck that I didn't know about. So there would have been Death Speaker, which has some water sites, but not enough that it turns off all of your effects, and then Enchantress, which the matchup's already good. Even when you have all of those dead berry effects, it still feels like it's a pretty good matchup. So at the end of the day, it didn't really matter.
We'll talk about the common sense package, I guess, to flow from the common sense. So just what we'd already covered, we'll just summarize it. So we already covered the Scent Hounds previously, and we already covered which is basically
Cave Trolls.
Infiltrate, Cave Trolls, which was basically for Root Spider. And then there's, technically speaking, Land Surveyor is kind of inadvertently part of that package, because I'm sure
if you ever don't need to get any of the actual package, and you just need to play it just to get it out of your hand and thin your deck a little bit, getting a Land Surveyor is always good. It's never really come up that it was bad.
And then I also seen
majority of the time you would be getting your Border Militia. The only time that really becomes an issue is if you've blown up a lot of their sites, and then they just don't have sites to be adjacent to. But yeah, that comes up where the Berry is also a good card to get, mostly against Earth-based other decks. So Berry is the worst option of Earthquake, Cave-In, and Berry in this deck in particular. But it does turn your common sense into a potential removal spell as well when you need it.
So the another thing that you do, I've seen you do it in our testing more than once, and I think I've seen you do it in the top 8, maybe the final, I think it was, that you common sense for common sense, which seemed to surprise a lot of people, but it wasn't surprising to me at all, because we've done it so much in our testing. Do you want to just talk a bit about that?
So
sure what's going
anytime you play your first common sense and you're late enough into the game where you don't the mana's not that much of an issue, and you don't really need to get your other common sense targets, you just get the second common sense just to get it out of your deck so that you can't draw it again, and then you get a Land Surveyor or something if the other targets aren't that relevant. And then I think we mentioned it with the Orb, but it's incredible with Orb because you can go get another copy of it, and it basically turns it into actual card draw when you're going up cards.
Yeah, so I mean you're basically common sensing for common sense in a way, just to thin your deck, right? To increase the
to thin your deck,
or Midland
of drawing
Craterize, Earthquake, or one of these other cards, right?
Exactly.
And then the Border Militia is a good option. Obviously, that is pretty amazing. Well, everything's amazing with the Orb, pretty much. But Border Militia can feel pretty amazing with that.
Yeah, sort of the worst case scenario is obviously if you blew up the board and then it's bad. But if you did that, you've already won, so irrelevant. There's very few games where you'll play it and get less than 3 1/1s. Quite a few games where you'll get between 4 and 5. And roughly, so when I was playing the Villagers, all the 1/1 throughout all the testing, all the 1/1s, they sort of felt like they were worth roughly about 3 life. So it turns Border Militia into either a threat that can kill them when they're on low life, or if you have King of the Realm or Crusade, or roughly between 9 and 15 life worth of blockers. And then, anytime you have it with Orb, it is just absolutely incredible because you're getting between 6 and 10 1/1s, and that is a threat to any deck.
Yeah, it's there were a lot of games in testing where it did feel just that's the game, and I'm not sure what else there really is that's ordinary that could kind of do that, to be honest. Like,
there wasn't really any. I think the biggest question with Border Militia is it could potentially be more of them. But I think at the end of the day, it feels like one is probably the right answer, and there should have been a Scourge Zombies in the main deck over the Conqueror Worm that you could get with a Common Sense as like your other generic option of just jamming a dude on the board.
Yeah, like the endless chump blocker, pretty much.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the Bury we cover quickly, but obviously that's just, it's ordinary. Is its main reason that it's in with the cave-ins and the earthquakes. Like if it's not ordinary, it's not in the deck, pretty much.
It's probably not. There's a fringe case where maybe it is, like, because it is still pretty good against Earthfire Sorcerer, with just being able to kill their Giantess, because that's the only minion they have that can really compete with your things on your side of the board. And yeah, it's obviously quite good against any other deck that sort of plays like a similar curve like this. It's good for dealing with Pudges, things like that as well. If they get it out early with a tower, for instance, before you could cave in.
Yeah, okay. And cave in? Let's talk about cave in. Oh, I think we've done all the common sense stuff related stuff, so we'll move on.
I think so. So cave in wasn't even really in the meta at all when we started building this, and I wanted to try it out just because it was Bury but better. Sure, it costs a little bit more. You can't shoot it for it, but as soon as we actually started playing it, it just felt incredible. Because anytime they don't have water sites, it's at worst a direct removal spell, and then sometimes you get 2-for-1s, which is nice, but the fringe case of more. But it felt incredible for when your opponent has like a very strong opener with like stone and cores, or even just like a stone, you can cave it in, because you don't, unlike Disenchant, you don't have to step up to be in range to deal with it. And yeah, if someone spent their first couple of turns developing cores and stone, and you 2 or 3-for-1 them with a cave in, it can completely cripple decks that don't have anything with Burrow to get up to bring them back up, which is another reason my Root Spider is just a little bit of added bonus for how good he is. But yeah, at worst it feels like a slightly worse Earthquake, and there's times where the fact that it costs 4 and doesn't make you bury your own minions if you have to do some awkward arranging with like a 4 grid, it's very strong. And then there's obviously the added benefit of, with Orb of Ba'al Berith, it basically becomes a targeted Earthquake in multiple locations.
Another big thing for this deck in particular is, I guess, versus Bury, is that the extra mana requirement is obviously for this deck is minimal, whereas a lot of other decks it would matter, right? It would matter a lot more.
Absolutely.
Gigantism.
So that's it sort of plays like a pseudo like removal rule if you're behind and you need to do it early on one of your 1/1s just to kill like something large of theirs. But it also has some very unexpected lethal draws. It is definitely one of the cards that I was like back and forth on quite often. And if Orb wasn't in the deck, I most likely wouldn't play it, and I would probably play an Overpower instead, just as part of the Common Sense package.
Which is another part of our anti-Root Spider tech, basically, right?
Absolutely.
To like power up to overpower your Root Spider to kill their Root Spider, basically.
Yeah, and you also have so many just random 1/1s lying around that you can, kill like a Kobolds or for free, or just trade into anything with free power. But it also lets you win like the Unicorn battles and things like that. But yeah, overall, the Gigantism, it definitely did a lot of good work for me in the tournament. But when you're sitting there and it's in hand, it always feels bad until it feels amazing and like a game-winning card. So it's definitely a interesting card in the deck for sure.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of felt like that in every deck we tried it in, to be honest. Because it's like, you're sort of like, I don't know, you have some weird situation where you have a Unicorn versus Unicorn and you're like powering up for 6 just so you can
get over the top.
Kill it, and it might as well have just been an overpower or something. And then there's other times,
or it might have well have just been like another minion or something in hand. But
yeah. But other times,
but then there's absolutely the games where you just surprise Death's Door.
I mean, I think because the life gain became a bit more, like over time, it's become more and more into the meta, right? As it becomes more and more like Angel's Egg is discovered as good.
Yeah, so being able to surprise Death's Door them actually is very relevant.
Yeah, because that extra 6 damage, I mean, in the case of this deck, it can be potentially an extra 12 damage, right? It's
and I have done that a few times as well.
It's I think it's better than that sort of unexpected 6 damage to push to Death's Door. It's a bit understated how powerful that is. It's very good to be able to do.
For sure. There was even a scenario in the finals against Enchantress in game 1 where I actually just played it on turn 7 when he had the double Angel's Egg. Because I knew I was going to Craterize the next turn, and there was no way he could get back above 10 before I did it. So I actually still managed to use it when I wasn't just straight Death's Dooring him, because it's like a very fringe situation that pops up when you're going to be able to Craterize on turn 8 to be able to Death's Door. So it gives you that even more reach. Because it is very easy to get someone to Death's Door when you Craterize them for 10.
Yeah, for sure. But yeah, I mean the double Angel's Egg, obviously it's a lot of decks just can't deal with that, but this one can. It's worthwhile, right? Because you've got the Craterizers, you've got the Orb, and the Gigantism, right? Those, and you're basically saying that you had to combine 2 out of 3 of those tools together, right? Like you could double Craterize, you could Gigantism and Craterize, which is what you did.
Yeah, exactly.
Orb and Gigantism, or you could Orb and Craterize.
Sort of the only other way that I would have been dealing with that is just waiting for a Roots combo, and then we both go into Roots at 20 life potentially, and then probably still win from there, but just because of how fast the deck reloads. But it's yet
another solution. But there's quite a lot of decks that basically don't have any solutions to that, right? Like if they manage to get both
absolutely
areas, it's like they can't really do anything about it. Like the Fire Earth sort of aggro deck is an
and that's another reason why I didn't need Disenchant, right? Because Disenchant is obviously a very good answer to double egg, but I didn't need it, so.
Sure. Earthquake?
Earthquake, just, standard Earthquake. It's just it's pretty much, is it the best removal card in the game?
Oh, no, sorry, one of the best few cards, I think.
Yeah, I was just trying to think if there is one better, and I don't think there is. Obviously, it's terrible if they have water, but
nobody has water.
Nobody has water. You can still rearrange water sites, which is...
Well, it's not that nobody has water. I think it's that nobody has only water, right? So they can have some water sites, but they have to sort of dance around them, basically.
For sure.
And as soon as they're coming onto your side of the board to try to do anything, then they definitely can be earthquaked.
There's even games where you casting it with no minions in play just for the rearranging is not even bad.
Yeah,
so it's just incredibly strong.
Card is like it's such a crazy good card. The rearrangement effect is so highly relevant, like in this deck, but also in many other decks. Like other decks we've built, the rearrangement effect can be like highly relevant in all sorts of different ways. Like it makes the card so powerful. Like we'll do a tier list at some point, but it's like it's certainly S tier by any metric. Pretty much like it's either the most powerful or one of the couple most powerful removal spells in the game. It's like either it's one of the most powerful earth spells in the game, like it's one of the most powerful magic cards in the game, it's one of the most powerful cards in the game, just straight up full stop, right? Like you're gonna do the top 10 best cards in the game, it's got to be on that list, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the fact that it's not nearby to the caster or like steps away is what makes it so strong. Because it's just like,
and also just the double earth route, like it feels a little bit, to be fair, this isn't the only card, but there's a lot of cards that just feel a little bit unbalanced, like a little bit too good, that should have some extra bit of threshold or text or something tagged on just to make it a bit fairer, and this is one of those cards, right? Like it's a little bit too splashable, basically.
I can agree with that.
And then is there anything else about we talk about how good it is generally, but is there anything specific about this deck? I mean, obviously, if you're borrowing their artifacts or whatever, you can bring them back up with your Root Spider, which you referred to before.
Yeah, there is that. But it is also like the rearranging, just moving their sites closer to your sinkholes in like nicer locations for you, so that you could be adjacent when you pop your sinkhole as well, so that you can just replace it for free with your avatar power.
You can potentially
that comes up a little bit.
Rearrange a rubble, right, to be adjacent to your Geomancer as well. Don't know if that ever came up, but that's something that potentially could happen, right, for synergy.
Yeah.
Cool.
And then there's Craterize. So Craterize is just it's just a way to kill people in general. This is a card that I was back and forth between one or two, and then because there were games where it did feel a little bit bad having to draw a site at the wrong time to be able to actually play it. But once the Land Surveyors came in, that problem shored itself up. And then once the Orb was in as well, with just all the small synergies just added up to make it strong enough to play two. And there's, with the targeting of it particularly, if their avatar is in their backline still, you can always just move all your minions to your backline and then nothing dies for sure. But then there's also like maybe they're one up and then only taking 1 or 2 damage, and it's not the end of the world. But it almost always, you can line it up that you board wipe them, you hit them in the face for a bunch of damage, you kill one of their sites, and then if you have a sinkhole in play or even a couple, you just you don't even worry about your roots anymore at that point. You just blast them with sinkholes, and then all of a sudden their board's clear. They're down to 3 or 4 sites, and from there you're just cruising.
And potentially, again, I don't know if it ever came up, but there's some additional synergies here potentially with the Bodyguard, right, to sort of save the prince or to save yourself getting hit when you roll it up.
Yep, that comes up because it's a replacement effect. So even if the Bodyguard would die, you could cast Craterize at your Bodyguard and then just take all the damage from your avatar, and you wouldn't be taking the damage, and then you'd still be fine. So you could potentially even cast it when it's double Death Door to kill them if you have the Bodyguard in play.
And obviously it's pretty amazing with the Orb.
Yeah, absolutely. So anytime there's a control matchup, you could potentially just not, if you think they can deal with the Orb, you just don't cast it. You wait till you draw a Craterize. You're probably unlikely to get to 13 lands if they're another control deck, so you just play it, hope they don't deal with it, and Craterize them to the face. But anytime they can't deal with Orb, Craterize is lethal from full health, so to Death Door.
And one of the main drawbacks of the Craterize is having to discard the site for the additional cost, but sort of with the Land Surveyors, you probably don't have to draw one because you probably naturally have just ended up with one at some point from the Land Surveyor. Yep. There's a good chance.
Yeah, and a big thing with the Craterize is it actually gives you another answer to Root Spider, which came up quite a few times in testing.
Yep. Yeah. Yet another.
Yeah.
Just we made sure that every deck we built had at least 7 different solutions to Root Spiders, basically. Even if some of them were a bit awkward, like Craterize is a bit extreme, but we were that scared of them. We honestly were.
Yeah. And it definitely felt like if the other deck didn't have Root Spiders, it felt like it was a good matchup anyway. So it does feel like Root Spider, even though it's played quite a lot, does feel a little bit underrated.
We'll go through the sites now.
Yeah. So the sites themselves are probably the biggest reason why this deck is actually good. And yeah, it's just because your sites themselves can buy you an incredible amount of time. Just through all the healing and the chump blockers, just everything going on early. And because you can always get to 6 without even needing to draw a site outside of potential not having the thresholds in your hand. So most games you can draw a lot of your spells early, which helps you hit your curve more often than not, basically. And I think I did quite a bit of like fine tuning on the mana base on the site specifically.
Yeah, because I know the Crossroads, for example, weren't sort of in the original deck list, right? And then we sort of put the roots in, and it was just there as a very secondary thing that might happen, but then the Crossroads ended up being added, and then it's something that was like way more likely to be able to pull off, right? The Crossroads were really
for sure.
The roots combo.
And I think a big reason why the roots combo and the Crossroads in particular came in was and some people might have already noticed there's a complete lack of gnome hollows in this deck, which people would think it's an automatically 3 of include. But the more I played this deck, the more and more horrible Crossroads felt. And it was almost always more of a hindrance than a bonus.
Sorry, you said Crossroads, but you meant gnome hollows.
I meant gnome hollows, sorry. Was because you just can't, like, almost none of your minions in the whole deck can go in there. So it messes with your blocking, your minion placement by an extreme amount. And because your first few sites, you don't really get to choose where they go as much as you'd like because of the replacement effects. And the fact that you never ever want to play it on turn 1, because playing a village on turn 1 is such an important thing in this deck, that it already becomes a site where you have to move to get into it, which you never want to move with this avatar if you can avoid it. I think in the whole tournament I didn't move once, which is optimal. So it also feels hard to get in there, and the upside of it doesn't really matter as much with this deck. But yeah, it's way more of a downside than it ever is an upside in this deck.
It also makes it more susceptible to Atlantean Fate, which is something that we thought that would be really prominent. That was a big part of our testing, being able to
absolutely
play into it.
Yeah, most of the decks that we wanted to play outside of this one in particular, or Avatar of Earth, had Atlantean Fate in them. So, and it was just such an incredibly powerful card. And this deck, the mana base in particular, is almost completely unaffected by Atlantean Fate, because the Bedrocks it does nothing to them. And then there's 7 villages, so it can't affect them anyway.
And the Mirror Realm,
and then
one of those.
Yeah. Well. And then the Crossroads, you don't even care. Sure, it can be sometimes a little bit annoying that it's a water site so that you can't bury on it, but overall, Atlantean Fate does almost nothing to this deck.
So the Bedrock, I'll just paraphrase some of these quickly, and then you can add anything you think that is missed between what you said and the paraphrasing. So the Bedrock is obviously really good with the roots. It's really good against Atlantean Fate, and it has pretty good conditional synergy with your Atlas Wanderers as well. Also just random other things that it's pretty good against, because it can't be flooded and things like that as well.
So there's one more thing with Bedrock is it's good with Rift Valley. Like, there's times where they can Rift Valley and it makes your draw very awkward, but it makes it a lot harder for them to pull off good Rift Valleys as well, which is important. And it's incredible against enemy earthquakes, because that can be quite a problem as well.
Yep.
Because they just can't be moved.
Yeah. So it's very good. I mean, and again, Earthquake was something we just assumed every deck playing Earth is going to run Earthquake, so it's good counter Earthquake. And then I also think we rated Bedrock really highly. I think every Earth deck we ever built is either playing Bedrocks or Rift Valleys, or both, right? Just because we also think Rift Valley is amazing. So it's kind of like, you're not playing Rift Valley, you're playing Bedrock, and vice versa pretty much if you have Earth.
Pretty much.
So it's sort of counter Rift Valley, counter Earthquake, counter Atlantean Fate, counter Flood,
counter Wanderers,
and then it's just strong. Counter their Wanderers, and and obviously it has amazing synergy with the Roots combo.
Yeah, it's a very core part of the Roots combo.
It's so good that it's like, I would say it's questionable whether this card should be exceptional rarity. It probably should be elite, but whatever, we're not the game designers. It's good that it's exceptional for this deck.
For sure.
Crossroads is you can squeeze, like, you effectively have the luxury of being able to fit it in because of just the rest of the mana base. So you have a couple of cards that you don't need the threshold, and effectively this was chosen, and mostly because it helps you find the roots combo pretty much, right? And
yes,
I think the roots combo in particular was just something that when we were testing, it was like pretty obvious that if you did it, you won pretty much unconditionally. Yeah. So, and that didn't matter when, right? And especially if you had a Bedrock, like you could just get to turn 5, turn 6 if you wanted. If you had a Bedrock and it was turn 6, you could just blow the board up and win easily. And the more it became obvious that as soon as you pull off the roots combo, you win basically by default every single time. Once that became glaringly obvious to us, it was just like the Crossroads just were pretty much just added to the deck and never leaving, right?
Yeah, for sure. One particular thing with it is if I ever saw it in my opening hand, I would mulligan it for free, because when you mulligan it, you basically get a quarter of the value of it without having to play it, and not having to play it is a big deal, especially when it's in your first couple of sites. But past your first 3 sites, it doesn't even feel bad to play, because the only other lands you'd want it to be is like the Sinkhole, the roots, which it gets you to, or potentially a pillar or a village. And if you quite often don't want to have to play your villages if you're going to be playing, like, using all your mana that turn. So it is, some cases it's even better than a village. And with that in mind, that's the turns that you want to play the Bedrocks if you can, when you don't need to be making a 1/1 with your villages because you're using all your mana. That's the optimal turns for those. It's also not even a bad card with Mirror Realm if it's like mid to late game, because it essentially guarantees you're going to be getting the combo of, like, the roots combo.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's another Mirror Realm. I mean, pretty much everything in this deck is a Mirror Realm target, actually, which is a bit
for sure
interesting. Not many decks can say that, right? But in this deck, it could literally be anything.
Past turn 6, it's like Holy Ground's not optimal, but there's even scenarios that come up where you've Sinkholed and you have, like, some of your adjacent sites, like, become available again. So even then, you can still pull off late game Holy Grounds and Mirror Realms.
The Holy Ground, we sort of touched upon it a fair bit, but it's the 3 life mostly, right? Is a pretty big...
Absolutely incredible, this land. It buys so much time in the early game. I think if I could play more of them, I would. Potentially, like, even up to 5, 6. It's just like anytime you hit it early, it feels like the early game is going so good that you're going to get to your mid and your late game power cards almost always. It just, the only time it's like doesn't feel good is if it's on turn 1 and you haven't taken damage yet, and even then it still makes your rubble because it's an earth site, so it doesn't even feel like it's the end of the world. And then obviously if you can't play it near your avatar, it doesn't feel crazy good, but it's worth it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was only really going to be swapped out for extra villages, right? Like, that's what...
Yeah, absolutely. That would be it's a village that you don't need a mana to activate in the early game, effectively. And around, like, so especially with the Holy Ground, like, around your mid, like, part of your curve, you have a lot of things to do. So having a land that you don't have to pay mana for to get the value can be quite strong.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's obviously susceptible to Atlantean Fate, but, you know, it's in the balance of the deck, right? Like, effectively, the villages and the bedrocks and whatnot, it makes the deck very...
there was... I think the first game of the top 8, I was at 7 sites, and none of them could be affected by Atlantean Fate between my villages and my bedrocks, because I mirror realm to bedrock.
Yeah,
and it was just like, well, I feel pretty comfortable here.
And as you say, it's possible that the Genesis isn't happening because you're not getting the life because you're already either at 20 or because it's not near you. But in the case of the village, you don't necessarily get the foot soldier right, so it's just
for sure.
It's just getting the balance of everything right to make sure that when you have the spare mana, you typically have a village, and when you don't have it, then maybe you can gain the 3 life instead.
Yep.
And do you think if you could have played more than 3 Holy Grounds, there would have been more than 3, or do you think 3 was just naturally probably the right number anyways?
Looking at it now, and with how well the villages actually played out throughout the whole tournament, feels like 3 might have been the correct amount. But during testing, it felt like I probably would have gone up to 4 or 5. So it's definitely interesting what the right balance would be. But because I definitely feel like I would never go below 3.
I mean, and there wasn't, as it transpired as well in the. I mean, I don't know if it was obvious from our testing, because we definitely thought Avatar of Earth was pretty good. And
I mean, at the end of the day, it was pretty good. There was 2 of them in the top 8 out of, I think, maybe 3 in the whole tournament that I saw. And
Battle Mage. I mean, the tangent that I was going off on a bit was if they have a highly mobile avatar, which is basically really potentially Pathfinder, but the Avatar of Earth and the Battle Mage in particular, they get up in your face, right? And potentially they're going to gain the 3 life when you do this as well, right? But that didn't really matter much in our testing either, because you're very
you're on the back foot matchups, so giving them a little bit of life early isn't going to be a a deal breaker anyway.
So it wasn't bad for them gaining the life pretty much, right? So that downside didn't matter too much, and it was as you said, maybe 3 was the right number in the end. And life gain is just generally very strong. It is a card that is played a bit, but I think it's a bit underrated for sure, just generally. I mean, I think it's generally rated reasonable, but I think we just rate it a little bit higher, I guess, than what the meta generally seems to rate it at, I guess. And it's also a mirror. There are all sorts of situations where potentially it's really good for the mirror realm to target it as well, right?
Yeah.
The villages, we'll just lump them all together.
So 7 villages. I've definitely covered it quite often, where it's like the turn 1 of village with a guy on turn 1 just fills out your curve so perfectly of what you want to be doing 1, because you don't really want anything in your deck that costs 1 unless it's like a powerful effect like Divine Healing that you wouldn't be playing later to anyway, because it makes it so that later on in the game you can't be drawing cheap bad cards that aren't really effective, whereas if it's just part of your mana base, it feels much nicer, and you can squeeze them in on your curve. And the 1/1 mortal, just very, very synergistic with how the deck wants to play out. I mean, it gets you to your mid game very, very consistently.
I guess other decks are, they're using cores and stone, and we'll get to later why they're not included, but I guess other decks that's what they're hoping to draw to fill the 1-drop with, but you don't have that, right? So and you're never going to play Divine Healing on turn, well, you can't anyways because you don't have the triple earth threshold, but it gives you something to do on turn 1, and it gives you something to do, which you've inferred many times, but I'm just summarizing here, that every time you have 1 mana spare for your turn, it gives you something extra to just fill the curve out, as you've said that many times. So it just makes things more optimal, basically, right? And
for sure,
all sorts of reasons why this deck in particular, like those foot soldier tokens, are more than the sum of their parts or something like that. They're important, right? They're important to surviving. They're important to winning. They're important for the chip damage. They're important for the chump blockers. They're important to do more than a little bit of damage when you have enough of them combined with these other effects. They have amazing synergy with stuff, all sorts of stuff in the deck, whether that's King of the Realm or Crusade, but also potentially even and with the Crown Prince, obviously, as well, and with the zombies when they come, what should be in the deck, or when they come in from the sideboard. Like, there's so much synergy that they have. And I think, as you said before, like, quite often you just will play it and you just keep it on the back line until like turn 5 or something, before it even comes forward. So you're not sort of suiciding these foot soldier tokens just to get in 1 or 2 chip damage. They're much more valuable to this deck to make sure they live, and that maybe they're blocking 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 damage rather than just doing 1 and getting killed.
Yep. And you never want to have them up in a position where they can be killed for free with a desert. And I think my most mirror realmed site throughout the whole tournament was Village. That tells you something about how strong they are for this deck, just in general.
Mirror Realm, which I guess we talked about a lot, but
yeah, I think the only cards we didn't really cover was like, I mean, it's pretty nice when you can play it next to a Sinkhole and then potentially set them back quite far after you play one of your like 7 or 8 drops, especially when it's a Craterize. Because if you can set them back 3 lands and they were only at 5, maybe 6, sometimes even like 4, then they're in quite a bit of trouble.
I mean, something from our testing, which never came to fruition, but I think, the meta changed a lot because we were testing for so long. When we started, Death Speaker was just everything, right? And
yes,
we had so many deck lists that just had Pillar and Mirror, right? Just to be able to do that effect twice.
Yep.
But I doubt you probably did it did you do it in the tournament in the end or not?
I don't think I really needed to, but the Pillar was definitely doing some work in the tournament overall.
And did you mirror realm one of your opponent's sites at any point?
No, but it's definitely always an option, but I never needed to. I definitely mirror realmed my Bedrock a few times as well.
Sure. Yeah, especially if you know that, you think you're going to roots, right? It's such a strong target.
Yeah.
And the Pillar...
It's also just the best... Bedrock is just the best site to copy if you're not curving out for that turn and need the village mana, pretty much.
Yep. Yeah, sure. And the Pillar, what was the most life that you gained from that? I know I played against somebody. I think they gained 14 or something from it in one turn.
Majority of the games, I was always on 20 or close to 20 anyway, so it didn't really come up super often. But I did have one game in the top 8 that me and my opponent went through majority of both of our decks, and he got one off for, I don't know, probably like 15 life or something, which it could have been more, but that's all he could heal.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, can be big. Do you think it's just in the deck, right? Like, it's so good against...
Oh, absolutely. There's no reason not to.
It's holy ground, isn't it, almost?
Yeah, it's a holy ground that you don't have to be nearby majority of the time, because it has the same issues as holy ground if you play it as like your first couple of sites where you didn't really need the life that much anyway. Late game, and if you're behind, it's absolutely incredible. It's amazing against Death Speaker. Obviously, it has some slight poor synergy with Scourge Zombies, but you can
Do you think
generally...
if you put them in the main? Like,
I think so. I think so still. It does. You can generally play around it enough that unless it's coming off of your replacement while they're in the bin, which can come up, but probably wouldn't that often because you can replace it on turn 4, and then you can't do it. So you only, if you have the Scourge Zombies, you can set it up so that you only have one replace for most of the game until like very late game scenarios. And majority of the time, you should be able to get it back from the bin by suiciding one of your models. So most of the time you can play around it. And then the times where Pillar is good certainly outweighs the potential of just removing one of your Scourge Zombies.
Sure.
Or if you brought them all in from the sideboard, then maybe removing them all. But you'd probably be able to play around it majority of times.
The roots, is there anything really extra to add here that we haven't already talked about? I mean,
quite a few times you'd rather not have it in play before you want to blow it up. But there are definitely benefits where if you know they can't interact with it through movement or Atlantean Fate, then having it in play is good.
It's
because
like
or that too, but also if it's in play when you pop it, if your avatar isn't tapped, you can just tap replace immediately and then potentially hit your earth threshold that you needed to play things if you didn't have any bedrocks. or go up to your second and third thresholds if you wanted to play things after you roots. That is relevant. There was also a couple of games where I had roots in play next to a sinkhole, but I was just winning by so much that I just never popped it.
I mean,
that scenario can come up where if you have that and you think they can move your sites around through earthquakes or wanderers or whatever, or bedrocks, rift valleys, then you probably do just want to pop it even if you are winning, just because of how quickly you can recover, unless they're Pathfinder or Geomancer themselves, because they can recover quite quickly as well.
Yeah, well, obviously time being an issue in regular rounds.
Yeah.
But I think the psych out comment that I made before is just it can be super awkward. Like when you see the roots there, it can.
Yeah, absolutely. Like if you hit it, if you hit it off one of your replacement lands and it's just sitting there, your opponents start playing different, right? And they potentially just draw more sites or just refuse to play sites, and then later on in the game they wouldn't have enough mana to do like multiple plays in a turn. They all do come up.
Yeah, like definitely. I'm sure it's almost like there could be weird enough states that come out of it where it's like potentially, probably not, but maybe exaggerating a bit here. But potentially, it's like you have the roots in the deck, but you don't even have the sinkholes or anything, right? Like you can't even blow it up. You just have it in there to just psych them out, make them hold all these cards back in their hand.
Yeah, especially if you're going to be playing bedrocks anyway, because then they would assume that you'd be able to blow it up. I mean, quite a few decks. Quite a few people, when they just saw Geomancer and Bedrocks, they just assumed that I was playing roots, and I was like, well, I'm not going to roots you this game, but sure, you play around it.
Yeah. So I guess it's almost like it's happening anyways, I suppose, even if it's not on the board. But I mean, it's definitely happening when it is on the board.
Absolutely.
And the sinkholes, I think you've obviously they're there for the roots, but you've also mentioned comboing that up just generally with a Craterize and then a sinkhole, and you board wipe them, hit them to the face, destroy 2 of their lands. It's it's a huge tempo swing.
Yeah, for sure.
Were you ever just sort of like turn 2 rootsing them or something? Sorry, sinkhole one of their lands or something? Were you ever just doing a random sinkhole when they were struggling with the thresholds a bit or something?
Never that early. I think the earliest I ever really did it was maybe turn 5 or 6. And that's because you're going up in your curve is generally more important than your opponent going down in their curve, because most decks you'll play against have like a lower curve than this deck. But there are certainly times when you can drop if you curve out like Unicorn, Bodyguard, Atlas Wanderers, then knocking them down on the curve can be quite strong, because maybe they needed to play something that, maybe they need to play multiple cards to get them out of that situation. Generally, you only want to be doing that if the sinkhole is in one of the areas where you can replace it easily from your avatar ability. If it's just creating a rubble in one of your non-adjacent spots, it feels quite awkward to do, because you want to be going up in your land more than other decks anyway.
Right, we got there. That's the whole Decklist. So this is the end of the first part of this podcast. Be sure to watch the second one if you're interested in this. In the second part, we continue the conversation and we start talking about the testing process for the deck and a lot of lessons that were learned throughout that process. Look at a lot of cards that were tested in the deck and didn't make the cut for the deck and why. And also talk about the tournament itself, the Australian-New Zealand Championship, and just the weekend in general in Melbourne. So hopefully you'll enjoy the second part as well. So be sure to check that one out. And just one last thing, if you do check out that deck list in the description of this video and you follow Wyvern on the Sorcery website, you'll be able to get notifications, hopefully, of future decks that I post on there that Jarrod and myself build, and primers about playing those decks as well. So we'll catch you for the next video, hopefully. And until then, keep safe, keep well, and keep enjoying your sorcery.